All right, guys, here is 2.1b. It is the end of the 2.1 homework, but it's a different assignment. So I thought it would be easier to make it two different videos. So when we're talking about quadratic equations, it's the degree 2. So your variable is squared, x squared somewhere, okay? X squared also often has an x. So we have x squared, x, and then a constant. How to solve these? They can sometimes be solved by factoring or by the square root property. So you can solve by the square root property if the equation only has an x squared and a constant. There's no x. Okay, this would be an x, this would be an x squared, this would be the constant. Okay, to solve by square roots, you want to isolate the x squared on one side of the equal sign and take the square root of both sides. When you take the square root of both sides, when you take the square root of both sides, so the equation only has an x squared and a constant. Here's my x squared, here's my constant. We're going to isolate the x squared on the left of the equal sign, the constant's on the right. Take the square root of both sides. Use plus or minus. So the square root of x squared is equal to the square root of 4, but it's the positive and negative. So our final answer would be x, because the x squared cancels the square, the x squared cancels the square root, equals the square root of 4 and the negative square root of 4, which means x equals 2 and negative 2. That's what they mean by don't forget to use the plus and minus sign, okay? If you cannot do that, if you cannot solve by square roots, you're going to solve by factoring. So let's go through here. We'll look at questions 23 through 30. We're going to see which ones only have a square root and a constant, and we'll solve by square roots, okay? This one does not have only an x squared and a constant. This does not have x squared and a constant. This does not have x squared and a constant. This has an x squared and a constant. This has an x squared and a constant. And this does not. Good. All right, so those are solvable by square roots. All right, so we know we want to solve 26 and 27 by the square root method. It only has an x squared and a constant. There's no x. First, you're going to isolate the x squared on one side of the equal sign. 26 currently says x squared minus 4 equals 0. We want to isolate the x squared on the left. That means move the negative 4. How do we move the minus 4? We add 4 to this side, do the same to that side, and we get x squared equals 4. Now that you have isolated the x squared on one side of the equal sign, take the square root of both sides. The square root of x squared is equal to the square root of 4, positive and negative. So that means x is equal to the square root of 4 and the negative square root of 4. What's the square root of 4? That can be simplified, right? We can put that into our calculator. The square root of 4 is 2. The negative square root of 4 is negative 2. So for number 26, we can say x equals 2 and negative 2. All right. Same thing here. 4x squared minus 20 equals 0. We want to isolate the x squared on one side of the equal sign. So we're going to add 20. Add 20. That gets us 4x squared equals 20. But now I need to divide by 4 because I want x squared totally alone. So I get x squared equals 5. Now take the square root. When I take the square root, don't forget the plus and the minus. So that means x is equal to square root of 5 and negative square root of 5. You cannot factor that any further. The square root of 5 is a decimal number. So we're done. That's how you solve by square roots. You get that x squared alone, and then you take the square root of both sides. Make sure you include the negative and positive answer. Good. And the reason there's a negative and positive answer is because what is the square root of 5? The square root of 5 is 2.236, right? So Let's talk about the square root of 5 squared. It is 5. However, it's also true that the negative square root of 5 squared is 5. So we need to include the negative version and the positive version because those could both be potential answers to x. That's why there's a positive and a negative. Good? All right. So that's the solve by square roots. If not, you can solve by factoring, by setting the equation equal to 0, factoring it, and then set each factor equal to 0 and solve. For number 23, it's already in factored form. Now we want to set each equation to 0, we want to set each factor equal to 0 and solve. Why? Because it's if this is equal to 0, the whole thing will be 0. If this one's equal to 0, the whole thing will be 0. So that's how we show that it's true. X minus 3 equals 0. That's what we mean by set each factor to 0. That is a factor. It is now set to 0. We solve for x. Here is the other factor. We set it to equal to 0, and we solve for x. So here we just add 3, and we get x is equal to 3. Here we just subtract 7, and we get x is equal to negative 7. So my answer is x is negative 7 and 3 for number 23. Good? All right. 24, you have two factors. Just like here we had two factors. Set each factor equal to 0 and solve. It's really easy when your factor is an x. You just say x equals 0, and that's your answer. And then your other factor is 16x plus 4 equals 0. Now we're going to solve for x. Subtract 4, and we get 16x equals negative 4. Divide by 16, and we get x equals negative 1/4. And from over here, x equals 0. Good? All right, here we have 6 times the quantity 8x minus 7 equals 0. This factor does not have an x, so we don't need to set it equal to 0. Okay, we just take 8x minus 7 and set that part equal to 0. Take the factor, set it equal to 0. If the factor doesn't have an x, you don't need to set it equal to 0 because 6 doesn't equal 0, so that doesn't help us. Good? All right, we'll just do the opposite. We'll add 7. 8x equals 7. Divide by 8, and we get x equals 7/8. Good? All right, 26, we got x equals 2 and negative 2. 27, we got x equals the square root of 5 and the negative square root of 5. Number 28, they're going to ask us to factor it ourselves. So we have 16x squared equals negative 28. I'm going to set it equal to 0 by adding 28 to both sides, adding 28x. I don't want to move that 16x squared because moving it would make it a negative, and you want your leading term to be a positive. How do we know that the 16x squared is our leading term? Because it has the squared. It has the exponent that is raised to the second power. So this is 16x squared plus 28x, because they're not like terms, equals 0. Okay, I'm going to factor out the biggest factor that I can. So what is a factor that is common to 16x squared and 28x, right? I can factor out 4x, right? So that becomes 4x equals 4x, and then 28 divided by 4 is 7. 4x plus 7 equals 0. Take each of those and set them equal to 0. 4x equals 0. Divide by 4. Divide by 4. X equals 0. 4x plus 7 equals 0. Subtract 7. 4x equals negative 7. Divide by 4. Divide by 4. X equals negative 7 fourths. So my two answers are x equals negative 7 fourths and x equals 0 for number 28. Good? Okay, number 29. We've got x squared minus 8x minus 9 equals 0. So we want to know, can we factor it? So just like we were factoring earlier in the semester, we want two terms that would multiply to equal negative 9, but add to equal negative 8. You've got 1 and negative 9, or you've got 3 and negative 3. Or you've got negative 1 and positive 9. Those all multiply to equal negative 9. Do any of them add to equal negative 8? Yes. This adds to equal negative 8. So x squared minus 8x minus 9 becomes x plus 1 times x minus 9 equals 0. What we're going to do next is take that first factor, set it equal to 0, solve for x, and we get x is negative 1. That second one, x minus 9 equals 0. X equals 9. So my two answers are x equals negative 1, x equals 9 for number 29. I just took it, I factored it, I set each factor equal to 0 and solved for x. And now number 30. We've got 5x squared equals negative 13x plus 6. Good. We want to set it equal to 0. So I'm going to move the 13x over and the 6x over. Why am I moving the 13x? Because I want my leading term to be positive. My leading term is my 5x squared. 5x squared plus 13x equals 6. Move that 6 over by subtracting 6 from both sides. It becomes 5x squared plus 13x minus 6 equals 0. Now, can I factor anything out? No, I cannot. So I'm just going to say, can I factor it? So I can't simplify this. Can I now factor it into pairs like we did with 29? I would need two terms that multiply to equal negative 6 times 5, which is negative 30, and that add to equal 13. Well, it sounds like, I thought 10 and 3, but that's a negative. That's a negative, that's a positive. All right, so we've got 30 and negative 1. We've got 15 and negative 2. We've got 6 and negative 5. Well, 13, 15 and negative 2 will work, right? Okay, so remember what we do when factoring by grouping is we leave the first term the same, 5x squared, and then the 13x becomes plus 15x minus 2x minus 6 equals 0. Good? Now we're going to factor by grouping. So we'll cover up those first two. 5x squared plus 15x. I can divide them both by 5x. I can factor out a 5x, so it becomes 5x times x plus 3. Over here, I've got negative 2x minus 6. That negative means that my leading term, or the term that I factor out, must be negative, so it'll be a negative 2. Negative 2x divided by negative 2 is just x. Negative 6 divided by negative 2 is a positive 3 equals 0. So now I've got x plus 3 times 5x minus 2 equals 0. And I'm going to set both of those equal to 0. X plus 3 equals 0. Subtract 3, subtract 3. X equals negative 3. 5x minus 2 equals 0. Add 2. 5x equals 2. Divide by 5. And we get x equals 2/5. And x equals negative 3 for number 30. All right, guys. Oops. Sorry, you couldn't see that. All right. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.